His fingers had stopped hurting an hour ago. That was the thing that should have terrified him. The absence of pain where pain had been screaming before. That merciful silence that was, in truth, no mercy at all. Leif Ormsson lay curled against the base of a fallen pine, and the snow had already begun to build against his back, packing itself around him with a patience that felt almost affectionate. The wind had dropped, which seemed kind, until he understood that the stillness only made the cold more total, more intimate, more absolute. There was nothing between him and the dark anymore. No sound, no movement, just the white ground and the black sky and the profound, indifferent arithmetic of his own dying. He tried to move his left hand and found he could not be entirely certain whether it had moved or whether he had only dreamed the instruction. His mind, that last warm thing inside him, was beginning to drift, not into sleep exactly, but into something adjacent to it, something that borrowed the comfortable language of sleep to describe a process far less forgiving. The cold had climbed up through his feet first, hours ago, and he had stamped and cursed and kept walking, the way he had been taught. But the night had been longer than he calculated, and the forest thicker, and somewhere in the white confusion of the blizzard, he had lost the path between Bjarne's farm and his own settlement on the eastern ridge. He thought of his wife, Astrid. He thought of the longhouse, the central hearth, the smell of burning pine and rendered fat, and the warm animal press of bodies, family, thralls, livestock, all breathing together in that long shared dark of the Norse winter, alive because they were together, warm because they refused to be separate. He had left that warmth voluntarily, out of necessity, and now the cold was showing him exactly how fragile that decision had been. In temperatures of -15 to -20 degrees, common in inland Scandinavia, from Yuletide through late Thori, an unprotected man with wet clothing can be dead within 2 to 4 hours. The Vikings knew this. They built their entire civilization around that knowledge. But to understand how Leif came to be dying against that fallen pine, you must go back to the beginning of the cold season, back to the smoke and the preparation, back to the long tradition of Norse winter survival, and to the chain of small decisions and bad luck that had finally stranded him here, where the frost was winning. The Norse winter was not simply a season, it was a presence, a force with character and will, spoken of in the old stories as something semi-divine, something that tested men and called the weak and reminded even the strongest jarl that the land owned all of them in the end. The months the Norse called Elir and Mersugur, what we might think of as deep December and January, brought darkness that lasted 18 hours in the southern fjords and grew absolute as one moved north. In the high inland plateaus of what is now Norway and Sweden, the cold did not merely drop at night. It settled. It committed. Temperatures plunged well below the point where breath became visible cloud, where the moisture in a man's nostrils could freeze if he inhaled too deeply, where the spit from a man's lips would hit the ground as ice before it spread. The Norse people had survived in these conditions for generations upon generations, and they did not do so by being reckless. Their survival was not the survival of individual heroism so much as the survival of collective intelligence. The accumulated wisdom of a people who had learned through centuries of painful trial exactly what the cold demanded of them and what it punished without mercy. They built their longhouses, their langhus, long and low and heavy-beamed, with sod or turf packed against the outer walls for insulation, with central hearths that burned through the night tended in shifts, with livestock stalled at the far end so that the animal heat drifted down the length of the building like a slow, fragrant tide. The smoke rose through roof vents or through the narrow gaps between the ridge beam and the thatch, and the interior was perpetually dim, perpetually warm, perpetually smelling of wood smoke and damp wool, and the rich exhalations of cattle, and the sour sweetness of fermenting grain. That warmth was not an accident, it was architecture. It was intentional human ingenuity, accumulated across so many dead winters, that it had become instinct, become culture, become the very shape of how these people understood their relationship to the world. To leave that warmth without preparation was not simply foolishness. It was a kind of blasphemy against everything their ancestors had learned. How long do you think you could survive if you stepped outside right now? Not into your world, but into theirs. Into the tree line, alone, in the deep of a Norse Yule night, with nothing but what you could carry. Leif Ormsson was 31 years old, which in his time and place was solidly middle-aged, a man who had earned his calluses and his gray-flecked beard. He was a free farmer, a bondi, of modest but stable standing, with a longhouse on the eastern ridge of a valley 2 days' walk from the nearest trading settlement. He kept cattle and a small flock of sheep, grew barley and rye in the short summer, traded surplus grain and wool for iron tools and salt, and the occasional luxury that made winter more bearable. His wife Astrid managed the household with a competence that Leif had long since stopped noticing, the way one stops noticing the dependable turning of the seasons. They had 3 living children, 2 boys, 1 girl. Leif's trouble had begun, as so many Norse winter troubles began, not with a single catastrophic mistake, but with a small one that compounded slowly until it became catastrophic. In early Mursugur, with the cold already locked hard over the valley, one of his 2 milk cows had sickened with something that turned her legs uncertain, and her breathing labored. A good milk cow was not merely a possession in the Viking world. She was survival itself, a source of the dairy that supplemented the stored grain and dried fish through the long, starving stretch before spring. Losing her would mean hungry children, would mean a spring started in weakness, would mean a season's deficit that could take years to recover from in a world that ran on such brutally thin margins. Bjarne Halvorsen, 3 hours walk to the west through the forest, kept cattle too, and had a reputation for knowing their ailments. So Leif had dressed carefully. Carefully, he had thought, though not carefully enough, and set out on a morning when the sky was pale and cloudless, and the cold merely fierce rather than murderous. He wore wool next to his skin, layered in the way all Norse men of his background learned young. A close-knit undershirt of natural wool, a heavier outer tunic belted at the waist, thick wool leggings wrapped and tied with leather bindings below the knee, and over all of it a lodkappa, a heavy outer cloak of coarse, lanolin-rich wool that shed light snow and blocked the worst of the wind. His feet were wrapped in wool rags before being pushed into shoes of tanned leather, stuffed with dried grass for insulation. And over these he wore tall boot wrappings of more leather, lashed tight. His hands were in thick mittens of boiled wool. His head was covered in a cap of sheep fleece, ears down. This was, by Norse standards, sensible winter clothing. It was not
The cold
light or
does not
comfortable,
negotiate.
but it was
It does not
functional.
reward effort
A
or
system
honor
of
intention.
layering that would be
It simply
recognized
performs its
as essentially
arithmetic,
correct in
and the
its
arithmetic
principles
is always
if
patient.
crude in its materials.
He reached Bjarne's without incident,
Wool
and they spoke
crucially
for a long
retains
time
much
about
of
the
its
sick cow
insulating quality
over sour ale
even
and dried
when wet,
meat, with
because
the low
the fiber
fire throwing
structure
warm
traps
shadows
air,
and a storm building
even
outside,
as it absorbs moisture.
in a way that neither man
This
acknowledged
was not
for too
something
long,
the Vikings
because
understood in the
acknowledging it would
language
have
of
required
physics or
one of
fiber
them to
chemistry.
say what both of them knew,
They understood it in the
that
more
Leif should
immediate
stay the
language
night.
of not dying.
But Bjarne's
Their
longhouse was
sheep were
already
their
crowded with his
survival
wife's elderly
technology,
mother and
his
the 3 grown
processing of
sons
wool,
and their families,
spinning,
2
weaving,
thralls
knitting,
and 4 head of cattle.
felting.
There
was
was
a
warmth
central
enough,
craft
but
of
not
Norse
comfort
women's
enough for a
work
guest.
precisely because
And Leif,
the
in that
output
male
was so
stubbornness
directly
that
connected
Norse
to the
sagas both
community's
celebrated
ability
and quietly
to endure
mourned,
the dark
had
months.
told himself the walk home
But
was
even
nothing,
good wool has
that the
its
storm
limits,
was still far off,
and Leif's limits
that he
were
had walked
tested
that
by what
path in
happened
worse
on the
weather.
walk to Bjarne's
The
farm.
storm reached him before he reached the halfway mark. It arrived not as a gradual worsening, but as an event, an atmospheric door slamming shut. One moment the cold was fierce but navigable, the path visible between the trees as a trough of compressed snow. The next, the wind swung hard from the northeast, and the snow came horizontally, coming so fast and thick and dark that the trees 10 paces ahead of him became gray shapes and then white shapes and then nothing at all. He stopped and turned his back to it and pulled the cloak tighter and tried to think. This was the first correct thing he did. Panic kills faster than cold in a whiteout, because panic makes you move. And movement in a blizzard without visibility burns your heat reserves faster than stillness and gets you more thoroughly lost with every step. But then he made his mistake. He moved anyway. Not in panic exactly. More in that cold, creeping anxiety that tells a man that stopping entirely in a blizzard is its own form of surrender. He thought he could keep the wind at his back and follow it east, since east was the general direction of home. What he did not account for was the way wind swings and eddies in forest terrain, the way a hillside can deflect it into a valley and change its compass direction entirely, the way a man walking by feel in a whiteout can drift 15 degrees off his intended line without ever sensing the drift. The Norse knew all of this, in the abstract. They told stories about men who had died this way. Leif knew those stories. He walked for what felt like 2 hours. The path never reappeared beneath his feet. By the time he understood he was lost, truly lost, not temporarily disoriented, the snow had worked its way into the gap between his boot wrappings and his lower leggings, and the wet cold had begun its slow, authoritative work on his feet. The first symptom was intense pain, a deep burning ache that many people misidentify as a sign of warmth returning, when it is in fact the nerves screaming as blood flow to the extremities begins to be rationed by the body's emergency systems. The body is not stupid. It knows that the core, the heart, the lungs, the brain, must be preserved at all costs, and so when the cold becomes severe enough, it begins to withdraw warmth from the periphery with a ruthlessness that can feel to the tissues being abandoned, like burning. Leif knew enough to keep his hands moving, to open and close the fists inside the mittens, to roll his toes inside his boots with each step. He had been taught this. Every Norse child was taught this. The movement kept what blood remained in the extremities circulating, delayed the point at which the cold could defeat the circulation entirely. What would you have done? Would you have stayed with Bjarne despite the crowding? Would you have sat still in the blizzard rather than moving? Would you have checked your Tinder before leaving on a winter walk? These are the questions that separate the living from the dead in the Norse world. He thought of the old stories again, the ones told in winter evenings around the hearth fire, stories not of heroes defeating monsters, but of men who had survived the cold through cleverness and stubbornness. His father's father had told of a shepherd who had been trapped 3 days in a spring snow squall, who had killed and gutted one of his own sheep and climbed inside the carcass for warmth. A gruesome and effective trick. The warm body cavity holding enough heat to keep the man alive until the storm broke. There were stories of travelers who had dug into snowbanks and found, to their astonishment, that the snow itself could shelter them from the worst cold of the open air, that the dead air trapped between snow crystals was a genuine insulator, that the temperature inside a snow burrow could stay stable at a survivable cold while the open air dropped to something lethal. Leif knew this. He had been told this. And yet the idea of digging into the snow with hands he could barely feel, hands that had now passed beyond even the mechanical fumbling stage into something closer to claws. The idea required an effort of will that the cold had been systematically dismantling for the past 2 hours. And it was Bjarne's unease, and his wife's silence, and Gunnar and Thorvald setting out at first light with broth and rope into the cold morning that they were well dressed for and well prepared for and unafraid of, because they had been raised by people who understood that no one survives the Norse winter alone, that the warmth at the center of the longhouse is not just heat, it is the warmth of people who will come looking for you when you do not come home. It is the warmth of a civilization built on the understanding that the cold is always out there, and that the only answer to it that has ever worked is the answer that answers together. The Vikings were not, in the popular imagination, a people defined by warmth. They are remembered as hard, violent, ice-blooded, as comfortable in the cold as the ravens that followed their longships. But the archaeological record and the Norse sagas together tell a different and more human story. A story of people who were afraid of the dark, who built fires against it, who told stories around those fires to keep the mind alive through the months when nothing outside the longhouse walls was alive, who developed elaborate customs around hospitality and shelter, and the obligation to open one's door to a cold traveler because they understood at a cellular level what the alternative to that door being open looked like. The Norse winter did not build hard men and women. It built people who understood, in ways that those of us who have never faced it can only imagine, exactly how soft we all are, and exactly how much we need each other to survive. Leif went back to his farm the following week. He walked carefully on his damaged foot and he carried nothing, because Bjarne sent two of the thralls with him to carry what he needed and to stay long enough to see the family settled and the fire properly established. His cow, the sick one, had died while he was gone. Astrid had butchered her and salted what meat was usable and had already begun rationing the dairy supply from the remaining animal. She had done this without drama and without complaint, and with the practical efficiency of a woman who had grown up understanding that winter was a series of problems, and that the only way through them was through them, one at a time, without flinching. They would be hungry before spring. Not starving, hungry. There is a difference, though it is a thin one. They would thin the grain stores more carefully than planned. They would add more broth bones and less actual meat. They would let the fire drop lower at night and sleep closer together for warmth. They would do what generations of Norse families before them had done, and what generations after them would do. They would take what the winter gave them and turn it into just enough to reach the other side. And on the night that Leif came home, before the rationing began, and before the careful management of dwindling stores, Astrid burned more wood than was strictly necessary, and the longhouse was warm from the floor to the ridge beam, and the children were allowed to stay up later than usual, and there was food, not extravagant but real, warm, substantial. And the family was all within arm's reach of each other in the firelight. And outside the walls, the Norse winter continued its long, patient work, indifferent, inexhaustible, immortal. Inside the walls, they were all still alive. In the Viking world, on a night in deep Mersagur, that was everything.